Hey everybody, Mike Rossi here, back with another video in my Making Sense of the World series. And this is something I've been wanting to do now for quite some time. In fact, I was aiming to do this as soon as I got back to the United States after a rather successful semester teaching at Webster University in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. But there's always some speech, some press conference that either Putin or Lavrov provide that I need to provide subtitles with. Which, as you know, if you had been watching my channel about a day or two ago, I uploaded quite an important speech that Putin had given to members of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, outlining his terms for peace in the war in Ukraine. And if you're like me, you know that these terms are nothing that we don't already know. And equally, they are widely likely to be discarded and rejected immediately by both the Ukrainian government and their Western supporters. And not a surprise, the peace summit in Switzerland that just concluded today did just that. But at the same time, the peace summit in Switzerland was, in my opinion, little more than an effort at creating some type of united front against Russia. And many of its supporters had even said from the beginning that this peace summit is really not just that, but it's just simply a way of brainstorming some ideas, because true peace cannot be achieved without Russia participating. So in the video that I had posted about 2 days ago, there was a couple people in the comment sections that were asking me what I thought were the likelihood of Putin's proposals to be accepted by the West, and how likely this was to move forward towards some negotiated settlement. So what I want to do in this video is to simply offer my own ideas, my own assessments about what both of these events will produce, if anything. And the short answer is that both sides remain diametrically opposed. There is absolutely no way in which Russia's terms will be accepted. And at the same time, Russia is under no pressure or is in any position to just simply relinquish control over vast areas of Ukraine's eastern and southern territories. So with that said, I'd like to just take a couple of minutes in offering my assessment over what has happened over the past couple of days and see if there is anything, any way in which both sides might find some agreement in moving forward. I also would like to mention that I've been invited on the Neutrality Studies podcast for this Tuesday, which is going to be my first time being a guest on their show, and I'm looking forward to speaking with them. So when I have more information about when it will be available, I will post the link to my page in the community tabs. All right, let's get started. And of course, if I move into PowerPoint mode, you know that I'm about to get academically analytical for a minute. Anyways, in the June 14th address to the members of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Vladimir Putin lays out Russia's terms for peace in a video that I also posted a couple of days ago. The first is Ukraine must completely withdraw all of its troops, all of its forces, all of its military hardware from Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and the Kherson regions. These are 4 regions that Russia has annexed, along with Crimea, to its own territory. Regions that the vast majority of the rest of the world, West, non-West, wherever, still sees as part of Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. So Russia is already laying down a major red line item, and that is to have Ukraine relinquish any control over these 4 territories. At the same time, Ukraine needs to officially abandon all initiatives, all efforts in joining NATO, and proclaim itself militarily neutral, non-aligned, and nuclear-free. Now, according to Putin, if Ukraine does this, Russia will immediately call for a ceasefire and begin what it sees as serious negotiations for peace. Part of that builds on demilitarizing Ukraine based on what was already agreed upon in the Istanbul agreements of 2022. And just to refresh the memory of some who might not be aware of what this is, in the immediate outbreak of war in February 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, within a few short weeks, calls for a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement were made by both Russia and Ukraine. Delegates met first in Minsk and then in Istanbul to hash out terms for peace. According to the Russian side, there was an initial agreement until the then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson stepped in, told the Ukrainian side not to sign anything else, walk away from the agreement, and continue fighting until they had better leverage to weigh against Russia. Russia sees this as the closest and most recent thing that both sides had agreed to, and so this is Putin's way of picking up where they left off. Alongside that, include protection of rights of ethnic Russians living in what will then be the rest of Ukraine. This means cultural, religious, linguistic, educational, and other rights that are codified in the Ukrainian constitution, as well as a rejection, and this is the most abstract thing that's been said for months, if not years, a rejection of all forms of Nazism and neo-Nazism, which, according to the Russian narrative, Ukraine has been awash in Nazi rehabilitation since 2014. So a number of Ukrainian alleged national heroes are little more than Nazi collaborators in the 1930s, 1940s. You might remember a couple of months ago, it might have been last year, when Ukrainian President Zelensky went to Canada, and he was addressing the Canadian Parliament, and Prime Minister Trudeau had said, "We have a special guest in the audience, a real Ukrainian hero, this Ukrainian anti-communist patriot," and everybody stood up and applauded, and of course people find out that the guy was literally an SS soldier. So this just adds to the justification on Russia's side that Ukraine is engaging in all kinds of grotesque historical revisionism, which not only betrays the memory of those Ukrainians who fought on the side of the Soviet Union, but just simply exacerbates tensions between radical Ukrainian nationalists and everyone else in the country, right, including ethnic Russians. Right? So these are Russia's terms for peace. Consequently, the emerging documents that are coming from the Ukrainian Peace Summit, which was just concluded this morning in Switzerland, give us the following points. Number one, among the agreed upon things, number one, Russia is identified as the main culprit of the conflict in Ukraine. Number two, Ukraine's territorial integrity will be supported and upheld. Number three, the threat to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine is unacceptable. Number four, free commercial navigation in the Sea of Azov and Black Sea. Number five, agricultural products from Ukraine must be delivered safely to all receiving countries. Number six, nuclear power plants must operate safely in Ukraine and under the full sovereign control of Ukraine. And number seven, all prisoners of war should be released in mutual exchange. And among 91 participants within this peace summit, 79 countries had supported it, put their names to it. 4 EU departments, we're looking at the Council of Europe, the European Council, the European Commission, and the European Parliament. And ironically, one disputed territory, which is regarded as a country, but Kosovo, last I checked, is not a member of the UN, and ironically is a disputed territory that the West had supported its breakaway from Serbia, which also, interestingly enough, supported this communique. So out of 91 participants, 79 countries, 4 EU organizations, and 1 disputed territory had supported this joint communique. All right, so with all of that, some assessments of what has transpired over the last couple of days. Well, I think many of you will agree with me that neither side is likely to be taken seriously anytime soon. Both sides remain diametrically opposed, and among the opening statements at the Swiss Peace Summit that were made by leaders of Western governments and organizations, interestingly enough, the two that came the closest to being the truth was Zelensky himself, and I'm surprised I will ever agree with her on this, Vice President Kamala Harris, who said that the proposals are not so much proposals as they are ultimatums, right? They are take it or leave it demands, maximalist demands that Russia is putting on the table. And so this is what they are seen as. They are seen as ultimatums by Ukraine and their Western supporters. But at the same time, the Ukrainian summit, which was never really seen as anything other than an effort at brainstorming, really just a way of trying to cobble together some united front, was already limited in strength and scope from the start. Chief of which is that a number of major countries and representatives were not there. First of all, China refused to attend. And number two, Biden refused to attend as well, right? Both of these were seen as slaps in the face to Zelensky. So the Ukrainian summit, which some people may have seen as kind of like a modern-day Yalta conference, was, as I said, really nothing more than just a conversation in trying to get as many people on board to agree to, as many terms as possible to then propose to Russia down the road. Now, the other thing is that I think everybody in Russia knew that its proposals were going to be rejected. No one had, asked Putin or Lavrov what they thought, but I think that even they knew that these demands were going to immediately be rejected and tossed out by Ukraine and NATO. In my opinion, these proposals were simply meant for the record, with the idea that if they are rejected, Russia sees itself as justified in continuing its military campaign and, at the moment, enjoying the military initiative. But at the same time, we also know that Ukraine will not capitulate so long as it has NATO support and investment. Even though Ukraine's support is minimal, it's drying up. It's not what the Ukrainian side had wanted. Zelensky, among others, know that as long as they continue to have unwavering support from NATO, they live to fight for another 2 weeks. And so NATO is invested rhetorically, diplomatically, psychologically, emotionally. They are invested in this conflict for as long as possible, if not to turn the tide and give Ukraine the initiative, but to tire Russia out, right? To possibly drain it of its resources and create a growing sense of war fatigue in Russia faster than anything in the West. All right. Looking at this from the Russian point of view here, a lot of people are saying, would Russia be taken seriously with these peace proposals? And in my opinion, this is not so much what Russia has willing to offer right now. You got to think about this. First of all, Russia is calling for Ukrainian forces to withdraw from territory that it still nominally controls. So it's not like Russia controls all areas of these territories and is just, getting Ukraine to acknowledge what is already a de facto reality. No, Ukraine still controls portions of all of these territories, which I'll show on a map in just a couple of minutes here. But Russia currently has the military initiative, right? And they perceive Ukraine to be operating on borrowed time with an expiration date. Now, for those that are following what's going on in the war on Telegram channels, you know that they are reporting things that mainstream media in the West are not, right? Mainstream media still wants you to believe that Ukraine is, standing up on its own 2 feet, that the tide is going to turn just, in the next couple of weeks. All they need is just a couple of F-16 hand-me-downs, or, at some point there's going to be an uprising in Russia against this. The evidence is just simply not there. The evidence that we get behind the scenes is that war fatigue is growing in the West. Financial military assistance is drying up, and Zelensky knows this, right? He knows this. He knows that he's also on borrowed time. So Russia can just simply run out the clock. with the understanding that every time Russia offers some agreement, some negotiated settlement with Ukraine, they know that they're going to get rejected, but that means that they continue a war effort which will give them greater leverage in future weeks and months. So the rationale of the Istanbul agreements in 2022 was cut a deal now to avoid conceding more in the future. And that's exactly what Putin is offering now. Putin is saying, look, the Istanbul agreements were 2 years ago. What we're offering now is a reality of what we have gained since then. Cut your losses and come to an agreement now and be able to keep Kharkov or Odessa. Because at this point, you're in no position to reject, right? You sort of, it's a take it or leave it set of ultimatums. But the other thing is this, right? And look, if I can get a little bit less academic and more pop cultural, I've spent many, many years playing real-time strategy games. I've done Medieval Total War, I've done Crusader Kings, I've done Europa Universalis. I like to joke that one of the reasons why it took me so long to get my PhD is because if you add up all the time that I've been playing Crusader Kings and Europa Universalis, it would probably be about 3 to 4 years. But one thing I know about these games, right, is that if you go to war with an opponent, you need to have greater leverage, not only on the battlefield, but on the diplomatic front to get what you want. So in order for Russia to reach its maximal gains, in order for Russia to get what it's proposing right now, they need to seize more territory, right? They need to either capture Kharkov, they need to capture Odessa, or both, or just have their forces reach the Dnieper, right? If they do that, if Kiev is surrounded, then they can present whoever's in charge in Kiev, or NATO for that matter, or whatever, with the idea of saying, look, now we want what we had asked in June of 2024. But knowing Russia, they may actually say, well, we captured Kharkov, it's now ours as well. Who knows? But the thing is that in any kind of negotiated settlement, if this is what Russia's red line is, these 4 territories, along with full Ukrainian demilitarization and rejection of NATO membership, they need to accomplish a lot more on the battlefield than what they have right now. Ukraine is in no position to capitulate to these demands. I think everybody knows this. Just take a look at the map, as I was saying. The areas in yellow are what Russia currently controls, right? In addition to the initial territory of Donetsk and Lugansk prior to the outbreak of war. And we're not including Crimea. Russia sees this as its own territory. So these are the 4 regions. This is Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. The areas in red are the areas that Ukraine still controls, including, for both Kherson and Zaporozhye, the actual titular cities of those oblasts. You might remember about 1.5 years ago, Russia did control the city of Kherson, but then they withdrew. Ukraine saw this as a major victory, a major capitulation by Russia's part. Depending upon what side you're on, right? If you're on Team Russia, you saw this as a strategic retreat to the other side of the Dnieper. And they haven't lost any territory since. From the Ukrainian side, hey, a liberation is a liberation. But at this point, the southern front has remained largely unchanged since Russia's tactical withdrawal and Ukraine's failed attempts at a counteroffensive. So for them to effectively give up wide swaths of territory that they still control, alongside abandoning efforts to join NATO, Ukraine is in no position at this point to do so. Although Russia probably knows this. So knowing that they will reject means that we will continue with the conflict and give Russia the green light to take more territory, which they're doing in the eastern regions here, as well as making some inroads around the city of Kharkov. Now, I'm not going to say that they're going to capture Kharkov. I'm not saying that this is part of any immediate military strategy, although I'm pretty certain that this is something down the road, if absolutely need be. Okay, so the thing here that we need to ask is there a point in proclaiming these goals that have not yet been achieved? Some of the comments on my page have said that, Putin is too greedy, he's too lofty, he has no idea what he's, talking about. He's in no position either to issue these demands for Ukraine. That may very well be true. But my guess, and this is only my educated guess, which at the end of the day, every analysis on YouTube is nothing more than an educated guess, is that Putin is putting this down for the record in saying these are Russia's, what will be probably seen in the future as Russia's modest demands. Now, if they're able to capture more territory, especially if they are now threatening the very cities of Kharkov in the north or Odessa to the south, then they can make these demands while relinquishing control of either of these two cities back to Ukraine in exchange for some negotiated peace. I don't know. But at the moment now, Russia seems to just be slowly bleeding Ukraine dry, with the idea of eventually, the West is going to tire of Ukraine, or running the clock out until November. If there is a Trump victory in the United States, all of a sudden the dynamic changes dramatically in Russia's favor against Ukraine. So my guess is that this is just Russia putting out there what it wants. If this is rejected, which it will, it just gives Russia the green light to capture more territory. What about Ukraine and NATO? And we got to be honest here at this point, right? It is a proxy war between NATO, even more specifically between the United States and Russia. Ukraine is, just the battlefield on which this proxy war is being fought. I've already said the summit was less a peace conference than a brainstorming meeting, right? I think that the primary goal was to establish some kind of united front among the primary players, which of course is the United States, the UK, France, Germany, and Italy, as well as its willing supporters. Right? So if you go back to the picture of all the countries that had signed on, you have these smaller countries like Ivory Coast and Palau. You have territories that are little more than, NATO colonies like Kosovo. Of course, they're going to go with yes. Israel even signed on to this agreement, rather ironically enough, right? But also note any defections and objections, which interestingly enough, the countries that did not sign this communique indicate a growing trend of multipolarity. I'll get to that in just a couple of minutes here, right? So the other thing to note is that there's no concrete plans for either how to reverse Russia's territorial gains, nor how to globally isolate Russia's emerging position. I already noted that China refused to participate, and the countries that did not sign this agreement, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, UAE, among others, right? Armenia was also one that didn't sign, but we're basically talking about BRICS countries. BRICS refused to sign and endorse these agreements. They attended, which initially was seen as a victory by the West and a slap in the face against Russia. But many of these countries just simply said, we're going to attend just for the sake of saying we were there and seeing what's being said, and ultimately it was rejected. And there was a couple of countries that just simply left before any agreements were made because, as the delegate from Colombia had noted, this was really not a peace summit. It was just simply a way for the West to show that it has some support. It was really an echo chamber, really more than anything else. But are there some areas of possible agreement? I was thinking about this as I was putting this video together here. Is there anything that both sides could possibly agree on? And knowing Russia's position on a couple of items, we might find some areas, right? Some contested, controversial areas. First of all, one of the proposals that the Peace Summit had offered was free commercial navigation in the Sea of Azov and Black Sea. I don't see Russia opposing this, but I do see Russia saying we're absolutely happy to have this happen so long as we control the territories around the Sea of Azov as well as the northern Black Sea. So, if Ukraine concedes to these territorial losses, if NATO cuts a deal with Russia, sure, Bob's your uncle. Absolutely no problem here. The point is free commercial navigation depending upon who controls what territory. Exchange of prisoners, I mean, this is a no-brainer. This is something that both the Ukrainian and Russian sides have been doing since the outbreak of hostilities. Nothing that I see Russia being opposed to. The prohibition of nuclear weapons. This is actually the most welcome statement to come out of that, because for weeks now, people have been talking about the escalation of nuclear threats. The West thinks that Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons. Russia thinks that it's more likely the West that will have a, twitchy trigger finger. And, if not from the United States, it could be some, more hawkish country in NATO, not maybe nuclear weapons, but it could certainly be Poland or the Baltic states that would just launch something. So the prohibition of nuclear weapons is, in my opinion, a welcome statement that I would assume that both sides would agree to. But there are still some major obstacles to this agreement. And the first is the territorial concessions. I've been saying this now since even before the outbreak of war in 2022. The biggest obstacle to an agreement, the Minsk agreements, was that Russia had already annexed Crimea to Russia. And, if you've been following my series on making sense of the world, I've been sort of focusing on parastates. I looked at it in general. I had a dedicated video to Nagorno-Karabakh, and I was going to do one on Kosovo pretty soon. And look, the long and short of it is that no state in the modern world will voluntarily acknowledge the loss of any piece of its territory. And this is the reason why Serbia rightly refuses to recognize Kosovo's independence. Ironically, Kosovo was there at the Switzerland Peace Summit. The United States insists it is an independent country, which goes against their objection to the same type of situations happening in Ukraine and Georgia. But, again, parastate politics is ultimately great power politics. But territorial concessions of Ukraine is something that nobody right now will agree to. Yes, you've been hearing some talk on Telegram channels about, behind the scenes, people saying that Ukraine may have to concede some territory. And even when it came to the Minsk agreements following the 2014 uprisings in Ukraine, there were some saying, look, if we give Crimea to Russia and Russia agrees to everything else, this may be a way forward, which of course was met by absolute opposition by political hardliners in Ukraine. And look, as I was saying, I don't blame Ukraine for this at all, especially if they have to acknowledge the loss of territory that they still nominally control. So as long as territorial concessions are part of Russia's non-negotiable position, there is no need from the Ukrainian side or their international supporters to even consider sitting down at the same table with Russia. An equally big obstacle, although not as insurmountable, is the abandonment of NATO aspirations by Ukraine. And by extension, I would say Georgia and Moldova, right? This is something that Russia has been saying for years. First of all, Russia has been steadfastly against NATO's existence, let alone its expansion. And, I happen to agree with the positions of other people like John Mearsheimer, among others, that NATO's biggest threat to security was not its continued existence, but its desire to expand, but not include Russia, right? So NATO's whole idea is we don't expand. We just simply take membership or consider membership of countries that want to join us. In that regard, it's a nice way of saying that we're not expanding into Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova, but we are considering the will of the people of those countries that want to join. Okay, fine. But if Russia is to be taken seriously in its desire years ago to want to join NATO, and NATO rejecting that, this is the biggest problem. If NATO's going to expand, it's going to have to include then Russia. Suddenly, the security dilemma goes away. But that's not what NATO wanted, right? It ultimately, as far as the Russian side is concerned, NATO's whole reason to continue to exist was to contain countries like Russia, and eventually larger countries like China as well. Smaller countries, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, I mean, these are bit players. Along with most other countries of the former communist Eastern Europe, the Baltic states are the best example of this. They're weak, they're insignificant, but once they're part of NATO, right, they feel invincible and doubly secure. So abandoning NATO membership by Ukraine is something that I think can only be achieved if there is an internal revolution in Ukraine and a more pro-Moscow government comes to power. But more to the point, NATO itself is going to have to then just simply turn its back on Ukraine, which they're kind of doing. If you have paid attention in the last couple of days, NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg has kind of said something rather dubious, and that is Ukraine can join NATO once it defeats Russia on the battlefield. Which, if Ukraine defeats Russia, there's no need for it to join NATO, right? It's sort of like if Ukraine is able to accomplish what it cannot do, it can then get into an organization that it thinks it can only accomplish on the battlefield if it joins NATO. Which also, if you think about it from the Ukrainian side, Russia invades Ukraine and NATO continues to expand. But they take Sweden and Finland, which are not militarily threatened. They get to join at Ukraine's expense, while telling Ukraine, well, you know, once you do the impossible, we'll give you membership. Which means that NATO's membership is indefinitely deferred. And so NATO is going to have to also have, sort of a coming to terms moment with itself, which right now, I don't see any evidence of that happening. How would we link this to larger issues, right? I don't want to spend too much more time on this here, but, what's the importance of all of this in the larger geopolitical world here? It adds to sort of the growing evidence of material, of literature, of arguments that, a global security dilemma is directly connected to NATO expansion. Whether you agree with Russia's actions in Ukraine or not, it is very difficult to argue that NATO has not been a major contributor to the security dilemma in Ukraine, and has, not contributed to Russia's military intervention within the country. According to Russia's version of events, they had been trying for years to work with NATO in finding some compromise solution. Even at the point of just making Ukraine militarily neutral, NATO says absolutely no. And as a result, it has led to a number of problems. Again, not just in Ukraine, but also in Georgia, Moldova, and if we are to take these, observations seriously, eventually NATO's influential expansion into East Asia. The second one, and this is something that the West will always scoff at, but I feel is the, 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that is the Kosovo precedent set by the United States. There have been arguments that have been said that what the U.S. did to Serbia sort of gives the green light for Russia to do to Ukraine. Great power politics might makes right. The United States will say that there is no comparison between Crimea and Kosovo, between what Russia is doing now and Kosovo. I urge you to go to the video that Putin had given a couple of days ago where he does talk about Kosovo. And interestingly enough, his whole idea is that if the will of the people of Crimea and the 4 oblasts that voted in a referendum for independence are to be taken seriously, right? Self-determination should override sovereign legality, right? The people of these regions of Ukraine voted, they wanted to be part of Russia. We must recognize that within the UN Charter. In an indirect way, he just legalized, he just justified Kosovo's separation from Serbia. Because while there was no referendum in Kosovo to secede, there was no public referendum, the evidence among the Albanians is overwhelming that they would have absolutely have done so anyways. It's sort of interesting how Kosovo Albanian leadership clings to the United States for support, and in reality, they need to listen more to Putin because he is justifying their unilateral secession more than anyone else. I would take down the statue of Bill Clinton in Pristina and put one up to Vladimir Putin after the speech that he gave earlier this week. But the point is this, that the United States will look at their attempts at carving up Serbia's territorial integrity as sui generis, right, as a special one-time only thing, which has no place in international law. But the point is that it can happen because the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Italy want it to be so, okay? But then they will reject territorial fragmentation of another country if it's supported by a rival great power. This is something that I want to discuss in greater detail, I think, in subsequent videos, the connection between the Kosovo precedent set by the United States and what's happening in Ukraine. I think another thing that we need to look at here is Russia greedy in its demands, or are they looking a couple of moves down the road and are confident in knowing that this is what they're going to get? They may not get it in a formal concession with Ukraine, but they can just simply freeze the conflict, even though they say they don't want a frozen conflict. But the realities on the ground are going to eventually dictate that you cannot go back to a set of pre-war conditions. And more to the point, Russia's resilience and pivoting towards the rest, away from the West, has given them that leverage. The idea that China chose not to attend this peace summit, the reality that BRICS countries did not vote to support this communique, already implies a growing multipolar and multilateral world, in which, if you look at the countries that supported this in Switzerland, they are NATO countries along with, small, NPC supporters that, go along for the ride because, it's in their best interests to do so. So the non-committal stances of BRICS countries, it doesn't mean that they're pro-Russia, but it certainly means that they are not going to put their names to a series of ultimatums that the West designed on its own without sitting down with Russia. I think that what we also will note is the potential political fallout in NATO countries over continued commitment to Ukraine's bare minimum defense. If you've been paying attention the last week or so, I forget when it was, but NATO had said that all NATO countries are now obligated to give money and weapons to Ukraine. So we are, if you're a NATO country, you are effectively giving your budget to the defense of a country that isn't even part of your military alliance, which effectively goes against the very reason for NATO's collective security existence. But also take a look at the leaders of these countries. They're widely unpopular. I read somewhere, I forget where, I think it was in Politico, although I could be wrong. There was a headline that said something about, the Switzerland Peace Summit was led by six lame duck leaders and Giorgia Meloni, right, the current prime minister of Italy. So you have Rishi Sunak, you have Joe Biden, you have Olaf Scholz, you have Emmanuel Macron. These people are widely unpopular in their respective countries, and if the European parliamentary elections about a week or so ago have anything to say, it's that the national populist right is now gaining increasing electoral momentum. If, let's say, elections in France, which are scheduled in a couple of weeks, result in Marine Le Pen's National Front coming to power, there's no guarantee that she will, but I say every time that there's a French election that it's not a matter of if but when National Front does come to power, provided that Macron can hobble and cobble together enough of a organized opposition against her. But if that happens, if Le Pen comes to power in France, if Trump comes to power in the United States, If centrist parties in Germany, like the SPD, the FDP, the Green Party, continue to lose votes to either AfD on the right or Sarah Wagenknecht's party on the left, there's going to be less and less initiative, will, to continue supporting Ukraine's ultimately losing battle against Russia. So war fatigue, financial fatigue may hit NATO much earlier than it hits Russia. So anyway, these are my thoughts. These are my assessments of what's happened in the past couple of days over what are really two diametrically opposed positions of negotiated peace over Ukraine. I could be wrong with a number of the things that I've said, but this is just sort of based on what I know, what I've read, and just what I feel. I think from Russia's side, they know that these proposals are going to be rejected, but it puts on paper as clear as possible what their war aims are. As far as Ukraine and its NATO allies, it is still very much a murky and very loose-ended set of conditions. Doesn't bring about any way in which the tide of war can be turned. It proposes things that could be seen as reachable, but the scenario, who controls what territory, is still widely ambiguous. If Ukraine's territorial integrity remains upheld, including Crimea, I feel that we are coming up to an inevitable frozen conflict. And the thing about frozen conflicts is that nobody officially wants them, but behind the scenes, everybody longs for them. Because as long as there is no final agreement to end the conflict, but nobody can do anything on either side, it gives both parties really an opportunity to regroup, refresh, relock, reload, and then retry at some point in the near future. That's the thing with most disputed territorial issues. Kosovo is a frozen conflict. Georgia with Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and of course Ukraine is going to remain a frozen conflict, well into the future, unless there is some major breakthrough on either side. If Russia manages to completely break through Ukraine's defensive lines, and more specifically, if Russia is able to surround and capture either Kharkov or even more so Odessa. If they take Odessa, it's game over. Or just simply have their troops reach the Dnieper. That may force some in the West to get Ukraine to come to some kind of a peace settlement. It also depends on what the West does as well. There could be an escalation of conflict. NATO could very clandestinely send forces, troops, whatever, into Western Ukraine. We don't know what could happen. But this is what we have right now. I don't see any side getting the other to capitulate. But for what it's worth, it lays down the reality that both sides remain diametrically opposed for the foreseeable future. Anyway, so I hope that you found this stuff to be interesting. It's just my own 2 cents here. I'm looking forward to engaging with my colleagues at Neutrality Studies in this coming week. As soon as that podcast is available on their page, I will give a link in my community tabs. I also want to thank everyone for your continued support, your listening, your comments, your likes, and those of you that are supporting me on Patreon as well as PayPal. I am in the process of doing 2 things. I'm going to start a Buy Me Coffee account as well. And I was approached by somebody from Rumble to consider opening up a page on their site as well, which I just need the time to do. So the page is growing slowly, but it is growing with the minimal amount of time that I put to it alongside my teaching obligations. I'm teaching 2 classes this summer, one on conflict resolution and applied topics, and a second one on post-communist transition in the former Soviet Union. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I will see you very, very soon with my next video.